Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about The Dark Crystal from 1982. I think there are certain movies you fall in love with as a kid and you don't remember the moment you fell in love with them. For me, there's a lot of them that I feel like just have become a part of my DNA or something. And I remember when I first saw The Dark Crystal. I was upstairs in my room playing with my friends, and my mom said, the babysitter's coming over. I remember hearing my mom say, I'm sorry, he has a lot of friends over. It's like more kids than originally said. And she says, that's fine. I think I can handle it. Something like that. It might not have been that, and she said, but I have a movie. And I was like, yeah, what movie? Like, what is this movie? We've seen all the Star Warses, so this is like the early 90s. And she said, have you guys heard of Dark Crystal? None of us knew what Dark Crystal was. And she said, well, it's a fantasy movie, adventure, by Jim Henson and Frank Oz. And I remember we ran downstairs because we were like, okay, that sounds cool. I'm not 100% if I'd seen Labyrinth or not. I feel like I probably had, but I definitely had not heard of this. And it completely took me away that afternoon. I was so enamored of that. And that babysitter was right. And I think we played Dark Crystal in my backyard for like the next 2 hours. And I think I rewatched it even while she was still babysitting. I was just so taken aback by it. And I loved 80s fantasy and Star Wars and all that kind of stuff. Errol Flynn movies. Even though that was like long past when it was the early 90s. But I still felt that there was kind of an attachment I had to that. It just felt like something I really had a lot of interest in. And this very much feels like an 80s fantasy film. And I'm not saying that as a detriment. I totally understand. It still confuses me how this was the one that made money and Labyrinth bombed financially, I find. Or at least this did a lot better than Labyrinth. I forget the exact box office performance of Labyrinth, but that this one did a lot better. I always thought it was the opposite, because I always viewed this as the magnum opus of Jim Henson. He made complicated puppets. He pushed puppetry to a more mature, fantastical place, that this was an artistic change, and he achieved it so much. But I also think because, and especially now, because I loved Jim Henson as a kid, I'd be reading up on him a lot, although I feel like I didn't remember much of it until the Defunctland thing. But I think this fits so into the early 80s fantasy stuff. People were able to accept it because the plot sometimes feels overly complicated and there's a lot of things going on. I don't remember having problems following it as a kid. When I watched it before shooting this, obviously, I felt that there are a lot of details. I almost feel like I should watch it again to fully grasp everything that's going on. I could follow what was going on, but everything with the Circes and then the Uru, that's weird. And I don't know. There's a lot of details in this, and I totally understand how this took on such a thing for my generation and for kids younger than me, much like Star Wars. I don't think this is, as a technical achievement, it's very similar to Star Wars. As a cultural thing, I think it's more of a cult thing, but is similar to Star Wars, not just because same producer, Gary Kurtz, and Frank Oz. You watch the original Star Wars, it's so good at world building. You immediately know there's a rich world there, and you're just getting a tip of it, a tip of the iceberg. You're just getting a peek into it. And Dark Crystal feels that way. I've never doubted this new prequel series, but when watching it, I was sort of like, well, I think there actually is a lot here. There's a ton here. I could totally see making more. I know Jim Henson was very against making any sequels to this, so there's other stories that could happen in that world, and I 100% agree, much like how in Star Wars you look at that world on Tatooine, you hear them refer to things, and you're like, what was that? I want to see that. Can I see that? I want to see that. And Dark Crystal has that ingrained in it. It's wonderful in what it's doing. It feels like such a full, fleshed out fantasy. And because in 1982 there were still things I would, a couple years ago, got a bunch of heavy metal magazines, and I would look at the ads, and this was very heavily advertised in heavy metal. There was kind of more of a fantasy stoner vibe, and this fits into that whole thing while being its own original fantastical world. And when I watched Dark Crystal, I'm kind of appreciated how smart Jim Henson was at making this completely original, huge artistic triumph of a movie, but also hitting the zeitgeist at the right time. He hit the right point. If he had waited too long, then, you talk about your Willows and your Labyrinths, and those didn't do as well, although Labyrinth is better than Willow, so you don't need to comment about that. Although I do enjoy Willow a lot. What this film is it shows how far he could push puppetry. And as you know, the Muppet Show had just ended. It was a year after, maybe less than that, if I'm looking at release dates wrong, The Great Muppet Caper. And I think he just really made a huge achievement with this film. I've never watched this film and not thought this is like one of the best filmmaking puppetry achievements of all time, because there's no humans in it at all. It's all puppets, you know. I mean, there's humans controlling the puppets, I know that part, but it just has so much confidence in what it's doing, and it's literally one of the most complicated looking worlds to kind of navigate through. And I don't think, you know, unlike something like Secret of Nim, which would also come out this year, they don't try to kind of soften the blow and narratively get it to work to be more accessible. I think everything with Jen is kind of in the typical like hero's journey type of Luke Skywalker thing, but they're not really trying to soften the blow of this world. They're really kind of going into it. And that might speak to how 80s science fiction and fantasy was a lot more complicated and didn't really, I think, have it down where they knew exactly how to make it like the $100 million kind of big blockbustery thing. They were more interested in telling these stories as they were. And I think Jim Henson was a great storyteller, and he understood the complications and the reasoning behind doing those choices. And when you look at what he does with Dark Crystal, he's saying things, I mean, I could read into thing about what the Xerxes did to that world, that you can read into now what past generations have done to this earth, have done to our culture. Much like, I know, the Grimm's fairy tales and how kids should be scared sometimes and worried, and it's unhealthy not to be, which I agree with. I would like to show this to my daughter at one point. I think maybe a little too young right now. But it is, I think, for older kids, I think it is much like Secret of Nim. I think this would be the perfect age for that. And I was like, I think mid-elementary school, something like that when I saw this. And I was the perfect age for it at that time. And I think when you get into it that way, you can delve into that world, but you can delve into the ideas of being like, you know, the idea of always being young, always being around, trying to push your expiration date, not understanding the time you have and how precious that is, but also not like ripping things from other people in kind of this evil sense of the word. I think there's things to read into about this film. I think there's such artistry, there's such beautiful cinematography next to the puppets in this. When he has the Uru walking with those beautiful clouds, I was just like, this is just some amazing stuff. I mean, I'm not gonna harp on about like, you know, how CG doesn't have this kind of tactile kind of feel to it that this does, but CG doesn't have the kind of tactile feel that this does. I mean, it's just like some of those shots are fucking outstanding in what it's doing. I mean, I was just like watching it like, this is just such one of a kind thing. I mean, with this and Labyrinth, I sometimes think about how like, I don't think puppetry ever got to the levels it did with these two magnum opuses. He really pushed the level of what he was doing with these films, and he pushed the level of puppetry to such a degree. I can't think of many people who have pushed that with filmmaking to the way he has. He's really a really complicated, interesting filmmaker. I think Dark Crystal may be the greatest evidence of that. The journey of it with Jen, I think, it feels like most fantasy films, but what it's kind of saying with all these worlds and all these things going on is like Jen doesn't overpower the story the way Luke Skywalker does. With Star Wars, it's very much, and I'm sorry I'm comparing it so much to this, but that's the kind of era it existed in, and I think it does sort of have an influence on it, but I think this is more prone to the world and less of the protagonist, the way that is. And although a lot of these fantasy films, I mean, the fantasy boom of the 70s, 80s wasn't because of Conan. I mean, Conan helped, but I think it was also because of Star Wars, because no one really knew what to do after that movie. Hollywood was in a scattershot for a while, like, Alien? Maybe? Like, they didn't know. So you could kind of get these things through. Although Jim Henson had to make The Great Muppet Caper to make this, and this was his dream project, but it feels in that world. But I also think it achieves more than probably any of them really did, other than what George Lucas was doing. It pushes the medium further because it's far more interested in telling a story than like, you know, showing tits or somebody cutting someone's head off or something. I think it is firmly in what Jim Henson was great at, or one of the many things he was great at. But two of the things I think we think of him most as is a puppeteer and a storyteller. And in both cases in this film, he pushes both of those things to a level that we've rarely seen before or since. And this film does that excellently well. And he is really in a league of his own in this, because it plays within what was going on, and there's a lot of great, interesting fantasy films of that period that I really love. But this is the one that to me was the artistic achievement. I really, really like this movie. I do find it like there's so much going on. Like I kind of want to watch it a couple more times. I was thinking about, like, we have a prequel series, and I know this is kind of a side point, I guess, but I think looking at that, like, I totally understand why you'd want to go into this world and discover more, because there just feels like so much there, and it's so interesting. You look at these characters and you look at these models, and I recently got to see them in the Center for Puppetry Arts in Atlanta. The Jim Henson exhibit in the Museum of Moving Image, I believe, has some stuff there as well, and just the awe of that world and all the difference, because it is so unique in what it's doing. I guess Labyrinth, the puppets in Labyrinth are sort of like this, but not really. And I just sort of love where it's going with this, like what it's saying with this. Like, it is a hero's journey, but it's also a rich kind of fantasy world. It's more about the story than any protagonist, that it's also that Jen is an interesting character, that he tried to make more complicated puppets. Like, he didn't just rest on, like, he had one of the biggest television successes of all time. He made the Muppets, he made Sesame Street, and then to do this was, like, artistically, in a very auteur sense, was just amazing. And also Frank Oz, who I think doesn't get really as much credit for this, although I think most people would agree it's more Jim Henson's project than Frank Oz's, or at least the authorship. But I think shows how great of a filmmaker Frank Oz is that he was able to kind of make this work as well, because cinematically it works so well. I often just watch this film kind of in awe, and it's really hard not to do that. I often am just like, wow, like, that's an achievement. Like, that'd be hard to do any time. It doesn't really matter about filmmaking technology here. That's just like, this movie is crazy. Like, holy crap. Like, every time I watch it, and then I get sucked into the world, and then I'll look at one of the puppets there, and I'll just be like, holy crap, like, that's really weird, but this really works. It really gets you into the story. Like, it's strange and bizarre and creepy and dark and sad, and there's ideas into it. I mean, this is the science fiction and fantasy of an era that cared more about the idea of your soul and the idea of what you're going to do to this world. And Dark Crystal has all those wonderfully great ideas within it, and it's just such an achievement of a film. I get why kids freaked out about it, because you grew up knowing Jim Henson and respecting Jim Henson, and you would watch anything he did. And I think anything the Muppets have done, I've pretty much watched my entire lifetime, except for some weird TV things in that ABC series or whatever. But for the most part, I've checked out everything, and for someone to be like, there's this whole other world that you didn't even know about, and then you get to step into it, and it's crazier than you could have ever imagined, and more interesting. And that's what I think I take away from Dark Crystal, is anytime I watch it, I think of how talented and how wonderful Jim Henson was, what he brought to it, and how he came up with this and came up with this world. And I can understand just the way it is, and knowing more about 80s fantasy, thinking is this his answer to science fiction and fantasy? But I almost look at it as, yes, it does play that way, but I think also that it is such an original, unique kind of movie. And he understood stories, much like how Hayao Miyazaki understands the flow of stories and where they go. I almost, when I watch this, I wish there were more of these. I wish there was more of this. It just shows you what we can achieve with these talents, and they're so unique in what they're doing. I never get over that. I was like, wow, it's just this and Labyrinth, and there should be so much more, and someone should try to do something this outstanding. And maybe it's one of the failures of humanity that we can't do that. I also think that this is just an outstanding kind of one-of-a-kind motion picture, and it's hard not to kind of sit back and just be in awe of it. But the story and the world is really almost as interesting as that. It's hard to say that because what they achieved is so mind-boggling, but I think that countering that makes this kind of this full life motion picture, and why there's such a cult following and why we can't stop talking about it. I almost sit back and go wow, that really happened to what it was. And it's just such a crazy, in-depth world of amazement that I don't think I've ever really gotten over, and I've just loved watching what it does. I get that it's more contemplative and slower to some people, but I just love what it achieves, and what it achieves is kind of something of a dream in itself. So if you have seen The Dark Crystal and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.